All right. Hey, everybody. This is going to be a continuation from where we left off on our day two conversation about research validated interventions. So we had gotten to the point when we left off on slide 166. So I'm going to be going through the remainder of the slides. I did want to give everybody just a heads up that there's been some changes to the slides from here that I'll be looking at, that we'll be looking at today. I know that Cheryl was going to make those available so that that what I'm going to be showing you won't exactly match what you previously had, but it'll match with the ones that Cheryl's going to make available to everybody. There were just a few changes to the slides that I made, so it's not any big drastic changes. Anyway, the slides that we didn't get to were the ones that where we were going to actually name some of the interventions, and we felt like that would be important for you to be able to, we talk about interventions, but then to be able to name some, because I know one of the tasks that you're going to have as a team before our next training is to take a minute or to take some time and review what interventions you may already have available to you, and then look at are there some that some schools may not have any, or some schools may have some but are in need of or may not be using them for the purpose in which they were designed. So we're going to have conversations about all that. But I did mention at the training that we go into like some examples of some of those interventions for both tier 2 and tier 3. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I expect this is probably going to take somewhere around 45 minutes. We'll see how it goes. We left off on just this slide where I was asking that why would you want to, why would we have intervention programs versus teacher-created interventions? And I mentioned this at the training. It's just one of the reasons that it's just as a teacher trying to create interventions, it would be really very difficult to replicate what interventions, an intervention program does. You think about the people that create the interventions have a knowledge set and unlimited resources and time to create those types of interventions, and then they even rarely get that right. And so that the idea that a teacher could just do it on their free time. And then we said that the bigger problem would be that even if you were able to do that, you'd have trouble then trying to, establish the research behind the program. And we wouldn't want to be using things that have not been found to be effective to be used on kids for whom a lot of things haven't worked to this point. So, so that's why we talk about why intervention programs. Every once in a while, somebody, will say, I'm really, going to kind of make the comment that I tend to be very high on programs, and that's true. I think of programs as tools, right? And I think about all of the professions out there, and you wouldn't find any professionals that don't want good tools, right? So that's what these intervention programs are. And in the wrong hands, they probably don't go very far. But in the right hands, which is a trained teacher that's motivated and equipped with a good intervention, then the odds start to get in our favor of being able to pull this off. So one of the things, we would want research validated interventions. And I mentioned the difference between research-based and research validated. Most core programs are research-based, but not research validated. Validated just means that it's been established to actually lead to the outcomes with the kids that we're about to, use it with. Whereas research-based means that, for instance, in reading, I mentioned that a research-based reading program would be aligned to the 5 big ideas in reading. But there's, it teaches to those 5 big ideas, but there's no research then that actually says it leads to an actual outcome. So it should lead to an outcome, but we don't know. So, and the instructional design of interventions is something that's very different than what you would find in most core programs. That's why you can't just take a core program and just try to, back up a couple of grades and have a student in it or a group of students in it. Even though it might be at their instructional level, it's going to not have what we call the instructional design that's required for kids that struggle. And that instructional design is one that has repetition. It controls the amount of new information. They're very, very explicit. They teach the skills to mastery. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that make a good intervention. And so I don't give interventions credit for teaching the focus skills. They should do that. But I really look at how does it teach, right? That's what separates a good intervention is how it teaches. And like we said, it incorporates the gradual release, which means that it's that I do, we do, you do, but it actually technically would be more like I do, we do, we do, and you'll do it when I know you're ready and you demonstrated that you're going to do it correctly. So the 5 big ideas that we talked about in reading, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, right? So that, and what we're going to talk about with interventions, one of the things, especially in reading, that separates like tier 2 and tier 3 interventions is most of your tier 2 interventions would be more targeted, which means that they may focus on one or more of these 5 critical elements. And whereas a comprehensive tier 3 intervention would coordinate instruction across the 5 big ideas, across these 5 critical elements. And so that, but for tier 2 kids, you might have a student that's just weak in fluency or just weak in phonics. And therefore that needs to be the focus. Whereas most of your tier 3 kids have having deficits or struggling across or multiple, if not all 5 of the big ideas in reading. I like to show this like a curriculum map, and this is for first grade, and this is why it would be so difficult to try to just create interventions. This is just one of the 5 big ideas. This is phonics, alphabetic principle, and then you just look at across the first grade. And the numbers going across the top 1, 2, 3, 4 across the top there. That means the months of the school year. And so you can see not only does a good program the scope and sequence, it's identifying what needs to be covered, but then what the sequence of the skills are, and then how the skills build upon one another. So the interventions do that part. If they're a good intervention, they should do that part. And then, but that's the focus part. But then what really separates the intervention, like I mentioned earlier, is the instructional design in terms of then ensuring that there's enough, that the skills are explicitly taught, there's enough enough repetition and the gradual release. One thing that's different about intervention is like in any given lesson, there may only be 10 to 15% new information. And so it's controlling the amount of new information to ensure that students are not getting overwhelmed or buried. And whereas like a traditional lesson and a core program in reading or math might have 85% new information and relatively little amounts of systematic review. Right. And a lot of core programs may not have a hear it, see it, say it, I do, we do, you do. Or if they do, they have very little. Like it might be very light on the I do, where I talk about it, and then maybe I show you one, and then you're expected to go do them as a student. Whereas interventions would never do that. They would ensure that I'm going to model it. I'm going to show you how to do it. We're going to do it together multiple times. I'm going to check for understanding. If there's anybody that's struggling, we're going to do additional we do's, and that would all occur before students might be released to go and do it by themselves independently. Another thing with the interventions is that the amount of repetition is significantly more than what you would find. That guided practice and controlled opportunities for independent practice, constant checks for mastery and understanding, and then what we call the 5 mores. And the 5 mores, I'm trying to see if I had that slide here. The 5 mores are just more explicit teaching, more modeling, more teacher feedback, more repetition, and more time. And so those are the 5 mores, and those are provided as necessary, but they're already embedded more into an intervention. The interventions already have more of all of those things in like core programs and core lessons. But the 5 mores would be that you could even then do additional of any of those 5, like additional repetitions when necessary. And that's usually built into the interventions. Interventions will often prompt the teacher when to do those, depending on what they're seeing with the students and their understanding of the skills as they're being introduced and students start to practice them. So here are some examples. I think this slide is somewhat useful, like core programs, just understanding this is an example for, if you look at reading programs, and this would be the same for secondary. I'm showing an example for elementary, but secondary, like a core textbook. And secondary, that's for tier 1, right? So that core, like an Algebra 1 textbook. ELA textbook that would be your core program. That'd be designed for tier 1. So core program over on the left hand column, that is an example in elementary reading would be things like Wonders, Into Reading. All of those are examples of core programs. They're designed for 1 year of covering 1 year of standards in 1 year's time. The assumption is that kids are pretty close to grade level because that's what they're targeting, are grade level skills. And so, but that, they have their place. And for kids that are tier 1, often then the core program is all that's necessary. Additional intervention, additional instruction outside of maybe a reteach might be necessary, but you typically wouldn't bring in a supplemental or an intervention program for your tier 1 kids. So, but your tier 2 students, on the other hand, do require some type of supplemental instruction, so that using an intervention that then would target the skills that are in question or deficit. So for instance, Road to the Code, and then you can see over in the left-hand column down here is the key for these for the code. So Road to the Code addresses phonemic awareness. Read Naturally targets fluency. And so when you see the F, you just go down there and you look, and fluency is, or F is fluency. And so I just wanted to give you an example. Phonics Reading targets phonics. Foundations are just words, teaches phonemic awareness and phonics. Language for Learning teaches vocabulary or targets vocabulary. So I just wanted to give this as an example of how tier 2 interventions that are considered supplemental, that typically this would be in addition to the student's core instruction, but you would identify, well, what is it that they're weak in that's causing them to be tier 2? And we talked on the last time we met about using informal diagnostic assessments for identifying those areas. And then once identified, these are the tools that you could use to go in and then teach those skills. And so, but these are just examples. We'll get into some more specific examples coming up. And then here's the examples of tier 3, or what I consider comprehensive interventions. But you see what they're doing. Like for reading mastery here, transformation, it's targeting phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, all of those skills. So it's coordinating instruction across those five big ideas. And why that's so important is that, think about your tier 3 students. What's different is that they're not missing just typically one of the skills. They're often having trouble with everything about reading, and they're multiple years behind. And so my recommendation is that the way to make this most manageable, that has by far the best track record with that group of students, is to use a comprehensive intervention, back them up. And we talked about there's a placement test that goes with the interventions that typically will tell you how far to back them up and where to place them in the intervention. And then you place them, and then it will take them from that point back, now systematically back forward, back through, but usually at an accelerated rate. So that's the difference between tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. So I wanted to show you some examples of tier 3 reading interventions. I'm actually going to show you an example of several types of interventions. Here's one called reading mastery. I consider reading mastery kind of the gold standard in intervention. You'll hear me talk a lot about reading mastery. I have a lot of experience with it, and the reason why is that I worked with at the University of Oregon during the Reading First years, where I was, and if you know anything about the University of Oregon, I was working with Oregon Reading First, but the University of Oregon is largely where direct instruction, which Reading Mastery is a direct instruction program, came from. It was created by a person there named Zig Engelman. And he was the creator of direct instruction. So it's kind of the big DI. Direct instruction is an actual methodology for teaching, and reading mastery is an example. They have lots of direct instruction programs, but this is an example of one. And so I just worked closely with not only the author, but other people at the University of Oregon that were well versed in direct instruction programs. So you'll hear me talk quite a bit about it. What I do know is that we saw good success with it in our schools that were using it. I know a lot of schools across the state of North Dakota are using reading mastery. Schools across the whole nation use it. Has a good track record. It's a K-5 program. There's an older version of reading mastery, and this older version right here is one called the signature edition, because a new version just came out. And so, but like I said, it's a K-5 program. That even though there's a newer version out, and I'm going to show you that one in the next slide, they still sell the older version, the signature edition. And the reason why is that there's a little bit of difference between the new and the older one. Still have the same author, has the same instructional design, and they're both K-5 programs. But the older reading mastery moves a little bit slower. It's probably a better fit for some of the lower students. If we looked at your tier 3 students, and your lowest of the tier 3 students probably would have more success in this reading mastery signature edition because of the rate that it moves. It's not as hyper aligned Common Core as the newer version, and the stories are a little bit more dated. It's an older version. But if I were thinking about, if I had a group of students that might be students in special education, that might be some of my lowest groups of kids, I might consider reading mastery signature edition. So if you were going to be purchasing reading mastery, then you might actually have the newer version for your higher, faster moving groups, and one of one kit of the signature edition for your slower moving group. And I know that causes a problem because then you're buying additional interventions, 2 different programs or 2 different editions of the same program, actually. So anyway, that's reading mastery. That it begins in kindergarten, and this is as a tier 3 program, actually has a placement test, so you could start it with a second grader. If you have a tier 3 second grader, you could have them take the placement test. which is available online for free, and it could show you what level that student needs to be placed into, and then you could purchase that level. So you don't have to necessarily buy all 5 levels. You may not have anybody in the upper levels, like for instance, grades 3, 4, and 5 in the first year. Yeah, like most of your kids actually in elementary are going to be placing in kindergarten or first grade level if they're tier 3 kids. So those may be the only levels that you need to get started. The placement test is not only going to tell you what level they place at, but how many kids place in that level. So then you'll know how many of the student workbooks and so forth that you would need. It also then would tell you how to group your kids, because all the kids that place at the same level could be a group. And so there's some real advantages to a program, these programs that have these placement tests like this. But then the other advantage, I think, of a program like Reading Mastery, and it's not the only one, I'll show you another one that does the same thing, but you could have them in this program for multiple years. This is not only an intervention, but a core reading program. So, I mean, I work with schools that actually use Reading Mastery as their core reading program for maybe, K2 or K3 students, especially if you have a high poverty population where lots of kids struggle and you're a smaller school. That's something to consider. An example of a school district that does that in North Dakota is Turtle Mountain. The Turtle Mountain schools are ones that are using Reading Mastery as their core reading program and have had terrific success. I think they're maybe in year 2 or year 3, and they are having higher gains. I just was hearing some of their results were coming back, and I know that they were having higher gains than schools, like outgrowing 3 times the rate of that typical rate of growth in across North Dakota. So anyway, that's one to definitely check out. Here's the new edition of it. It's called Reading Mastery Transformations. Like I said, has the same instructional design. It's very similar in a lot of ways, but there have been it moves faster. You don't have to, it's pretty well aligned to the Common Core without having to add anything additional. The stories have been updated, can again be used as a core program. You could use it as a tier 3 replacement core or as an intervention. The problem that you'll have, though, if you're trying to do it like have the students placed in the regular core, the regular grade level core, and then doing Reading Mastery is going to, it's going to take 60 minutes a lesson. And so it's really hard to fit in that if kids are going to be sitting in the entirety of their core reading lessons day in and day out, and then somehow trying to fit in Reading Mastery when you have to have a minimum of 60 minutes. And especially if you're trying to get kids caught up and you're trying to accelerate it, you're going to need more than 60 minutes. So anyway, it's worth checking out. I'm sure you could order copies or examples from the publishing company of the two to compare and contrast the new version, transformation versus the old version, which is the signature edition. So, but I feel pretty strongly you couldn't go wrong either way. Another intervention that's available, it's called Early Interventions in Reading. This is another example. This is K3 program. It's an example of a tier 3 program, Early Interventions in Reading. Somewhat similar to the Reading Mastery. It's has a placement test. It was written by Joe Torgerson of the Florida Center for Reading Research. Has a good track record. It's been around quite a while. Would be listed as definitely a research validated intervention. That would be one that would be worth checking out. So then we have the Readwell is another one. This is published by Sopris West Voyager Reading, Voyager/Sopris West out of Colorado. And so theirs is a K3 program. I work again with schools. I have historically worked with schools that use this as their core reading program. could also be used as an intervention or a replacement program for Tier 3 students. It's has a good track record. It's not as like scripted. It's scripted, but it's not as tightly scripted as Reading Mastery. I would probably say, whereas I said that transformations would be maybe for your higher level Tier 3 kids, that would be the same with your Read Well. Probably wouldn't work with your lowest of your Tier 3 students. So those are a couple of, or several good options for Tier 3 reading programs. Here's an example of a program for that targets language. It's called Language for Learning. This would be terrific for K2 students. That you can actually do this as a standalone, or if you're using Reading Mastery, this is the language component of that core program, but you can use it as a standalone for kids that might have poor language skills. A lot of kindergartners that come in, I would recommend that you consider doing something like some type of language screener, and students that struggle on that or fail a language screener would be good candidates for going into Language for Learning. What that really means is they don't even have the language to start reading instruction. So what might appear to be struggling with reading, the acquisition of early reading skills, actually may not be that per se, and it may actually be directly related to its deficit in language with your really young kindergartners, and that what they need to do is establish a language foundation before they even start reading instruction. And so that's what this could be used for. So I work with a lot of schools. I know when I was working with the West Fargo School District, they were speech and language pathologists were using this as language intervention programs for their speech kids, their speech and language kids. So that's an example. The follow-up to Language for Thinking is one or Language for Learning is one called Language for Thinking. And this could be used for typically kids that either place above Language for Learning or finish Language for Learning would be candidates for going in to Language for Thinking. And this can be used for grades, I believe it's 1 through 3, but actually if you have low level language kids in grades 4 and 5, they could be in Language for Thinking as well. Then it shows here kind of what the programs target, and there's also a placement test that goes for Language for Thinking. Both Language for Thinking and Language for Learning, which is this program right here. Remember, we said this would be the first one, and this would be the follow-up to Language for Learning. Both of these programs could be done as a standalone, and could be. When I think about if you have students with poor comprehension skills in K1, what it really is poor language skills. So these programs could be used for that. Lessons take about 30 minutes a lesson. You can do them whole group, you could do them one-on-one, or small group, but it also could be done as a whole class. So I think a lot of kids could benefit from these two programs. That's some examples of elementary reading. I wanted to show some, then talk about some examples for the secondary. There's just a broad overview of some examples, and then we'll talk some more about some of the specifics here. Are listed corrective reading, and there's both corrective reading decoding and corrective reading comprehension. You can do either one of those as a standalone. If you're going to do it as a replacement core, you would want to do both, so that the kids would be in a decoding lesson and a comprehension lesson, each of which take about 45 minutes a day to complete. That's an example of a Tier 3. Could also be used for Tier 2, but it's typically used as a K3 program, grades 3 and up. Read 180 is an example. Like I'm a big advocate of Read 180. I like Read 180. The expense of it can be problematic. I know that a lot of schools may have some additional or initial funding for interventions, but you have to really be careful with this program. because the question really can it be sustained, going in the future when those funding sources have ended. So Language Live is another one, Reading Plus, Wilson. Like I said, we're going to talk about, I just wanted to give an example of, what are some of the ones that are commercially available at the secondary level. And there are some good options, there really are. There's as many good options at the secondary level in reading as there are in elementary. So I'm going to go into a little bit depth here of some of these specific intervention programs that have been widely used, especially in North Dakota. One is called Language Exclamation Point, and this is a program that could be used grades 3 through 12. It's been around a long time. It's published by Voyager / Sopris West out of Colorado as well. Also, and like I said, it's been around a long time, so long that it's now it's slated to be discontinued. How quick that's going to happen, I don't know. So if you were really interested in this, you'd have to buy it pretty quickly, because I don't think it's going to be available in another few years. The problem with that, of course, would be trying to get material for additional student workbooks and so forth. So I would definitely want to ask the publishing company if that material, like the consumables, will be continued to be offered. If you were to buy this, the new version of Language Exclamation Point is called Language Live. And so that's been the update from the Language Exclamation Point. What's really changed about it is, one, it's a different author than who wrote the other one. Louisa Moats wrote Language Live, and she's really known as one of the foremost experts in the area of literacy in the entire world, actually. But she was the author of Language Live. This program typically takes a class to 2 classes. Ideally, there would be 2 classes devoted to it per day at the secondary level. So if you think about it in place of a regular language arts class, and then a second period devoted in place of an elective for a student, then you'd be able to get 2 periods a day done. It's really going to be a matter of what kind of gains you want to see. So if you have two periods a day devoted to it, a lot of kids may complete this in a single year. Whereas if you only have 1 period a day devoted to it, those same kids may take then 2 years to complete it. So there's some flexibility in how to do it. You wouldn't have to have 2 periods devoted to it. But the gains that you're going to see are going to be directly related to how much time students are spending in it per day. But teachers like this. It's a good program, has a good reputation. Language Live now has been around a while. It's listed on all almost all of the reviews that you'll see of Tier 3 interventions. This is considered a Tier 3, but you'll see this one largely mentioned pretty widely. Another one is called Reading Plus. So this is for grades 3 through 12. I think of it as, one that is really good targeting reading fluency and comprehension, but there's a lot of vocabulary in it. So I've worked with schools that have used Reading Plus. Sopris West Voyager is also the publisher of a program called Rewards and Rewards Secondary. There's actually Rewards Intermediate that you could use for grades 4 and 5. And then there's Rewards Secondary that you could use for grades middle of 5 all the way up through high school. What Rewards does is that this would be an example of a Tier 2 intervention, right? So whereas Language Live would be a Tier 3, Rewards would be a Tier 2. And the reason for that, remember we mentioned that a Tier 3 program is more comprehensive. It targets all of the reading and writing skills. So Language Live does that, targets the 5 big ideas in reading, whereas Rewards does not, primarily targets multisyllable decoding. So advanced phonics. And so for a lot of kids, though, that's the issue, is they have trouble reading big words, multisyllable words. And the problem with it is there's so many of them by the time, there's so many multisyllable words by the time you're getting into middle and high school. Right. So I read somewhere that there was over 10,000 multisyllable words that mostly appear after grades 5. And they also tend to be more of your like your content reading words, right? So think about how many science and social studies words are related to, are multi-syllable. So, but this, for kids that have trouble with this, your tier 2 students, this would be a great option. It takes a class period to teach it. It also, it's going to address vocabulary, because as kids are able to read more words, they're going to have access to more of the vocabulary. If you can read the words, your comprehension is going to improve, right? If you're able to accurately and identify words with automaticity, then your fluency is going to improve as well. So it does a lot more than just the multisyllable decoding. Then there's also the Rewards Plus, and Rewards Plus, whereas you can use it to address or use the teaching of multisyllable decoding in the context of science, social studies, or writing. So there's some really good options here with Rewards and Rewards Plus. I know a lot of secondary teachers really like this program. So I have some slides here that just go into what Rewards is. So if you wanted to, do a little bit deeper dive into this program, I have slides for you to be able to reference after this presentation. And then a few slides here of who it's designed for and what the grade levels are. Another secondary intervention that I would really be, I'm a big advocate of, is called corrective reading. What I like about corrective reading, whereas I mentioned that Read 180, the problem with it is it can often be cost prohibitive. Corrective reading is very inexpensive. A lesson of corrective reading will take about 45 minutes. So they're designed to be completed in a traditional class period. And you can have kids as young as grades 3 in corrective reading all the way up through adult. So there is really no age limit. There's a placement test that would tell you where kids place. There's corrective reading decoding and corrective reading comprehension. I mentioned for your tier 3 kids, they probably would need both, especially if they're low in vocabulary and comprehension. You could also use it more tier 2 strategically if you had kids only that were low in comprehension. Then they could be placed in just that. Each one of those would be a class period a day devoted to it. So it takes a class period to complete the comprehension lesson, a class period to complete the phonics lesson. I work with a lot of schools that may only have kids in the corrective reading decoding part, because they're just poor readers and they're just trying to bring up their reading skills, but they don't have big comprehension or reasoning issues. When it says corrective reading comprehension, it's a little bit misleading. That comprehension tends to be more of a program that is addressing vocabulary and reasoning, and doesn't really teach like a lot of comprehension strategies per se, even though it's, when you read the title, you may think that it does that, but it really doesn't. It's more reasoning and thinking. The corrective reading program, there's multiple levels: level A, B1, B2, and C. You probably wouldn't have many kids in level C, so this is another one that if you bought it, you give the placement test and could identify where your kids are going to place in it, and then you would order those levels. So, and then the kids that all place in the same level, that could be a class. So you might have a 7th grader and 4 8th graders, and in a B1. And so, and a B1 it's 65 or 60 lessons designed for half a year. So most of those levels, but if you have kids starting in level A, right? You're probably looking at, gosh, a couple of years for them to complete all of the corrective reading levels. But as they do, their reading success is going to be going dramatically up. Their success and how fluently they read, how accurately they read, their reading comprehension. So there's placement tests that you could use for this as well. And this slide, I left it in, but the Reach Higher system is no longer available. I was just looking online for it. It's really just the Reach Higher system was one that Corrective Reading had, where you could combine it with other programs to create a comprehensive program like reasoning and writing, so that there was the phonics part, the comprehension part, and the writing, or the reasoning and writing, which is the vocabulary and the comprehension. But my understanding is that they have just recently kind of done away with this program, so this may not even be available now. Although expressive writing and spelling mastery and those still are. You could still buy those separately and create kind of a very systematic core program of interventions by using the corrective reading and those additional programs. Okay, I've talked a lot about, and we're going to get, when we're finished, I'm going to show you my bias list of interventions in reading and math as well. But let's talk a little bit about what are some of the math programs that are out there. And, for this focus area, there are some good options, probably not as many as there are in reading for some reason. I think the reading, there's just historically been more focus on. It's been around a little bit longer. There's still good options in math, and they talk about, if you look at what they're identifying that are important elements of math interventions. Number one, and this is by no accident, the instructional explicitness. How explicit is it? How straightforward? Does it teach through questioning, or is it very direct, or is it taught in a very direct manner? The more direct with struggling kids, the better. You don't want programs that are promoting guessing, or promoting the teaching, what I call teaching through questioning. You don't want programs that, especially in the field of intervention, you want programs that are super explicit. You want them that have an instructional design that ease the challenge of learning, right? So, and what that means by that control of new information that's being presented. For math interventions, you want one that has a strong conceptual basis. So, whereas the concept of the skills is explicitly taught, and the students understand that. The emphasis on drill and practice. So the drill and practice, especially of some of the computation skills that students are required to have to be successful in math. The cumulative review, one of the recommendations you're going to see is that there's a math intervention program should have built into it every single day some portion of time that is devoted to drill and practice of math facts, right? So of the basic concepts and ways of then finally also built into the math intervention should be something that is designed to motivate and monitor the students' work. Think about, these are kids that have historically had trouble with math. They may not like math. One of the things that good intervention will do is it'll start to change the students' perception of themselves as math students, where they do that because they ensure that kids are being successful. They back them up, and then they're teaching in a way that allows the students to be successful and learn. And so with that comes more motivation, right? So that they are able to do it. And now all of a sudden you'll hear students say things like, and these are middle and high school kids that have been in math in over their heads for many years. And you'll hear them say things like, well, I used to not like math, but I like it now. Or it's like, I used to have a hard time in math, but now I think it's easy. Them saying that's a good thing, right? That means that the intervention is doing its job. It's doing what it should be doing. Great. For some reason, my computer has decided to freeze up for a second there. Here we go. So let's talk about some of the interventions that do those things we were just talking about, right? That are systematic, that are explicit, that back up, that teach conceptually, teach to mastery. So the same things that we talked about in regards to instructional design for reading are every bit as important, if not more so, in math. And so what you don't want is a traditional core math type of program that has all kinds of design flaws, especially in how it's being taught, because it was designed for kids that don't struggle, right? So those programs can make a lot of errors, and a lot of those kids are still going to pick the skills up. But that's not true with our kids that struggle. You know, they're going to do well depending on if the program does well. The program teaches well and doesn't violate a lot of the rules that we know are important when it comes to learning, especially learning for students that have historically struggled. So one such program is called Voyager Math or VMath. This is a tier 2 math program designed for kids grades 3 through 8. This would be like typically a minimum of 20 minutes per day. Ideally would be 30 minutes, but it's done in addition to the student's core program. What I like about VMath is this is one of the things that I think is a big selling point, is that it essentially has the diagnostic assessment that's built into it. So it's going to survey the student's skills before they ever get started. This is an online program, by the way, so you'd have to buy like student site licenses. But what I like about it, and what most teachers like, is that there's an assessment built into it that the students would take. It identifies where the kids' skill deficits are, where those holes are in their math skills, and then it has then it's going to have units of study that are designed to address those skill deficits. And so that it also does progress monitoring of the skills. So I like it that the kids can be doing it independently on the computer, doesn't require a teacher to directly be teaching it all the time, so that you're able to have different students in the same group or class going on at the same time because they're at their own levels, and that's determined by the program. So you could, at the secondary level, you could have like an entire, a group of 7th and 8th graders come in, and you could have like 12, 13, 15 students in a class, and they're all going to go sit down at a computer and they could be doing VMath at the same time, and the teacher's job would just be go around and monitor and answer questions and just ensure that the students are working their way through the units. And so those daily lessons. So that's VMath. Normally I'd be asking, are there any questions? But on this kind of format, that's hard to do. So what we're going to hope that you're able to do is that as you're watching this video, jot down some of the questions that you might have and bring those back to our day 3 training. We're going to spend some time going over these the interventions and the things that you were asked to do at the conclusion of day 1 and day 2, so that we have some time to touch base, work with you can get questions answered, maybe be able to pair up with another team, and here are some of the things they may be doing. Here's another tier 2 math intervention program called Spring Math. And this would be for the Spring Math is designed for grades K-8 and tier 2. So, and it can be used. What I like about Spring Math is I have not used it directly, but it's actually designed to be used just for 15 in as little as 15 minutes a day, and can be school or class wide, so everybody's doing it, or it could be targeted to a small group or individual students. And it has the assessment built into it as well. And so then for tier 2 intervention, just a great option here. For a tier 3 program, especially grades 5, 10, would be one called Trans Math. That's published through Voyager, Sopris West. You'll hear these same kind of publishing companies come up quite a bit. And what happens is they tend to specialize in a lot of these intervention programs. So then they make, they make multiple programs. They may make some reading and some math programs. So remember, we talked about this is the Voyager Sopris West is the program or the publisher for was the publisher for rewards that we mentioned earlier. Well, here's one that's published for the for math in the area of math. Again, tier 3, grades 5, 10. There's a placement test. It's a very structured, systematic program, not scripted. And so if you have teachers going to be using it that are very opposed to a script, this does not have a script, and that's one of the things that I think is actually, in my view, is a kind of a downfall or a weakness of the program. So what you have to have is a teacher that's going to bring to this program some of that good structure that's necessary, right? So they're going to have to make it more explicit, because the book I think the program does a good job of backing kids up. But that instructional design where it's built in and it prompts the teacher through the use of scripts and stuff is really absent. And so the teacher would have to be bringing that to the program. I think one that's used to teaching any kind of direct instruction program could use this, because they'll just incorporate a lot of what they do with their direct instruction program. An example at the elementary level of a tier 3 math program would be one called Connecting Math Concepts. This is for certain an older program. It's designed to span for grades K5. Before Common Core, it was grades K8. I work with lots of middle schools that use this. If you're a tier 3 student and you're in middle school, you're probably going to be in somewhere like 3rd grade math. So that means you'd be in level C. They have the levels in Connecting Math Concepts go level A, B, C, D, E, and F. Right. And so level A is largely aligned to kindergarten, B, 1st grade, C, 2nd grade, and so on and so forth. That's what it's designed to do. Placement test in Connecting Math Concepts is going to show you where to place. And then again, there's placement tests that are available online from McGraw-Hill that you could download for free. Then you could administer this to your students. And that placement test, and it's going to show you what levels that you need, right? What levels kids are actually placing into. It's also going to show you how kids are grouped together, because the kids that are grouped together or that place together in the program could be grouped together. So I don't know if you have questions about Connecting Math Concepts, let us know. This is could be a great option for some kids that just have had limited math success, that are really candidates for a core replacement in math. I work with some schools that have a core replacement for some kids in reading, and core replacement, those same kids might be in a core replacement for math if that's what their needs are. More targeted intervention, tier 2 would be corrective math. Corrective math is module based, so there's addition, subtraction, multiplication, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, fractions, decimals, and ratios. And so depending on what students are having, you might have 7th graders that it's just fractions are having trouble with. So there's a placement test. You probably wouldn't be doing any of the levels, any of the modules, with the exception of just with the exception of lost my train of thought there. Anyway, you wouldn't be doing the whole program. You'd just be doing the module that the student has been identified that they're in need of. So I think that's what I was trying to say. Corrective math, one of the things nice is the lessons are about 30 minutes long, moves pretty quickly. Students that have really struggled will pick up these skills in a pretty accelerated fashion. can be used again all the way up into high school. So corrective math, I think, is a great option for some students. The other thing that's good about reading or corrective reading and corrective math is that they tend to be fairly inexpensive, and there's no site licenses that you have to renew because there's teacher manuals and student workbooks. And so you would have to renew the student workbooks, but you're not having to renew like these expensive licenses. So once you have this, it's available. And what you might find, if you're not sure, go check around in your special ed departments and see if any of these programs are being housed there. A lot of schools may have these, even though they're not currently using them. It may have been that teachers in the past bought it and it's sitting in there, but somebody doesn't even know that, that it's research validated or what it could be used for. So it could be a really good option down the road. Here's, anyway, those modules, addition, subtraction, so on and so forth. We just talked about those. Another great program for high school would be Essentials for Algebra. And I really think of this as a tier 3. I think of this could be used for 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. This is for kids that are either at risk of failing, not ready for Algebra 1 because they don't have the prerequisites to be in algebra, or for kids that have already failed Algebra 1 that now need to repeat it. I would be very reluctant just to have them go in and repeat the exact same thing that they just failed. Where if I had a tool like Essentials for Algebra, I would simply use that. I'd use that as my pre-algebra program for kids that, like I said, are in tier 3, or for kids that have failed math. And I would use the Essentials for Algebra. So I just have here an example of what one of the lessons looks like. And you can see it's very, very scripted. Right, that is like the whole nature of it. So it has the scope and sequence that it really does teach the concepts of algebra really well, teaches the steps of algebra, does not move too fast. It's that one that abides by that 85% systematic review, 10 to 15% new information being presented in any given lesson. There's a lot of systematic review. So anyway, the Essentials for Algebra might be a good program, good option for your secondary students that are in tier 3. Here's, I mentioned corrective math. Here are the modules. My biased intervention, because we've been naming specific interventions, and I really try to be careful that I don't go on and name it's like 5 pages of intervention. I know that it's just historically what I have heard from teachers and schools that I've worked with is some options are good. They just want to know, like, what are some of these? What are some that we could actually order some samples of, we could look at, but it can't be the world open. Like, it can't be 10 pages of these things because it's overwhelming, and then we're not able to decide. So I come up with what I call my biased list of interventions. So here it is for elementary. So my biased list of interventions means that it's biased because I've either used it myself or I've worked with schools that have used it and we've seen the results, and I've also seen the review of the programs. And you have to be careful with the review. I'll talk about that, but it's like you have to look at who's reviewing and what their criteria might be when they're reviewing an intervention program. But I can tell you the direct instruction interventions that I mentioned earlier, like reading, mastering, corrective reading, have a terrific track record. So my first recommended for K3 tier 3 or K5 tier 3 would be reading, mastery, signature, and transformations, depending on the groups. Might have, like I said, your higher groups in transformation, your lower groups in signature. But if that's not possible, completely understand. And if you have more kids that tend to be lower, then you might consider reading, mastery, signature, edition, and maybe holding off on the transformations. I mentioned early interventions in reading, published by SRA. There's Read Well, corrective reading, and then the Wilson reading system. I think the one challenge with the Wilson reading system is the training requirements for teachers. right? What's required for teachers in order to be able to be certified to teach Wilson is pretty significant. And so it's like you could use reading mastery, and it requires a fraction of the amount of training, and there's no real licensure required for being able to teach reading or reading mastery or corrective reading. Here are two reading interventions. By the way, I have a cold, can you tell? I feel all stuffy. Uh, but luckily I don't have to go anywhere. The tier 2 interventions and we call them strategic because they target, right? They're used strategically to go in and target the skills that kids need work on. So here's an example. Phonics for reading is one. That's a tier 2 reading intervention for K3. One of the things that you'll like about phonics reading, if you don't have it or haven't heard about it, it's very inexpensive, probably one of the more inexpensive interventions out there. And again, K3, so you could have second grader in the first grade of phonics for reading. Rewards intermediate, that's teaching advanced phonics or advanced decoding skills, right? So rewards that could be used for your 4th and 5th graders, rewards intermediate. So those would be the kids that don't have basic phonics skill deficits, but they're having trouble reading bigger words. And so the rewards intermediate would be a great option for that. Foundations targets phonics and spelling. Language for learning, language for thinking. I already talked about those. 6-minute solution would be one that would target potentially reading fluency, right? So I think about read naturally would be another example. I like 6-minute solution better because it doesn't take the amount of time. So you could do that and build that into the intervention period. We're also doing something else. And then sort of success out of print. Sort of success is, but I know that there's still some of that out there floating around on eBay. Have lots of schools that get it that have been able to purchase that, and so it's actually worth it. I think it's a great option for if you have kids that are in tier 2 for reading comprehension. My bias list of secondary interventions would include things like corrective reading, both the decoding and the comprehension. Especially if reasoning and thinking and vocabulary is low. Otherwise, I might just do the corrective reading and double up on the lessons each day. It moves pretty quickly anyway. Kids like corrective reading. I mentioned it's very inexpensive, nothing that you would have to go in and buy additional like licenses or anything. Language Live, we mentioned that it replaced language exclamation point. It's essentially a 2-year program. There's Language Live 1 and Language Live 2. And depending on where you place, that most kids will probably place in Language Live 1. So then you would begin at the starting level lesson, of Language Live 1. It would take a full year that's devoted to it. If students are placed in level 2, then they'll only need 1 year of it. If they're placed in level 1, they're going to need 2 years. 1 year to complete level 1, 1 year to complete level 2. No, that sounds like a lot, but remember, these are the kids for whom a whole bunch of things have not worked. And I think the greatest danger is we just continue to do those things. We have the same outcomes we've always had. And that's why I think these interventions are worth their weight in gold. They are seriously the tools that are going to help this group of students overcome these deficits. But they also help the teachers in making their jobs and their lives easier and more manageable. So Read 180, I mentioned or I don't know if I did mention, I like Read 180, been around a long time. One of the knocks on Read 180 is the expense. Right, so there's quite a bit of expense related to Read 180. Wilson reading, I mentioned about the training requirements, Barton reading and spelling, all examples of tier 3, tier 2. Rewards secondary for advanced phonics or decoding skills, Rewards Plus, where you can teach the phonics skills in the context of science and social studies. Read to Achieve targets reading comprehension. That's an online program, fairly expensive. Achieve 3000 is another good program. That primarily targets reading comprehension. Achieve 3000. There's the Read to Achieve that teaches or targets reading comprehension strategies, right? Like being able to use the use of a graphic organizer, and the Read to Achieve comes in both the narrative and content. So narrative would be like for applying it to fiction, and content would be like applying the Read to Achieve strategies to your own, to students' own science or social studies textbooks. So that's usually a big selling point for educators. Achieve 3000 primarily works on reading comprehension. Reading Plus addresses fluency and comprehension. 6-minute solution addresses just primarily fluency, building reading with automaticity. For math interventions, some of my examples for elementary connecting math concepts, and I talked about that. That's a tier 3 math program. Corrective math, tier 2, could be also for used with tier 3. The Voyager math is tier 2. Spring math is tier 2. You notice I wrote down the grade levels for these. Math 180, that would be your tier 3 students. So, and then the one at the very top, the connecting math concepts there, that in your top left corner is the one where I mentioned it's very scripted, and each lesson in the connecting math concepts may take 45 to 50 minutes. So secondary interventions on my bias list would be essentials for algebra for sure. Unnecessary, we have kids failing algebra, right? If we have kids on failing algebra, then something's going wrong somewhere for that group of kids. And so I would more proactively identify who those kids are, so we can head off the whole failure part, place them in essentials for algebra and give them an algebra 1 credit for that. I can show you exactly what's missing from the algebra 1, or the essentials for algebra, for it to be able to that you would have to add, and then so it could qualify as addressing all of the tier core, or the tier 1 or the core standards. Corrective math, we already talked about that. We talked about trans math, V math, spring math, and math 180. So we've talked about all of those. I have a friend, Kevin Feldman. I was looking at his list of what he called his bias list of interventions. So you'll notice it's pretty similar to the one I just presented in my presentation. Some of these would have to be updated, like language exclamation point should now be language live. So anyway, it's just I was struck by the similarities in what we both identified as our bias list without ever communicating. Here is a chart for an intervention chart. Get that out of the way. There we go. Anyway, and this is just designed. This was put together by the North Dakota MTSS folks, where we are just identifying like the program, what grades it cover, and then just a quick description of the program and who the publisher is, so that if you're interested in ordering, there's like Reading Corp, for instance. If you're ordering and getting more information, then you would be able to identify, who you would need to reference and who you could contact. But there's some remarks or a description of the programs and what they do here. So there's the language for learning and thinking. Here's Lexia, 6-minute solution, Read to Achieve 3000. But what I like about this is that it just goes far in depth of all these things that we've already talked about. So I think that might be helpful for you as teams, as you're starting to look at these interventions. Sorry, just trying to move my, have something blocking my screen here. Reading mastery. There's others here. My intent was to go through every one of these. I mentioned Read Well, Language Live, Read 180. So we're getting close to the end of the presentation here. I mentioned quite a few programs and mentioned that those are considered evidence or language or research validated, right? So there have actually been studies and then replication of those studies of looking at those programs being used with kids that are similar to the populations you're going to use them with, to look at what the outcomes were. And I think one of the things that you have to understand is that when you're reading the reviews, right, so you have two options. You could go and read the research from the publishing company themselves, probably a great way to put yourself to sleep when you're having insomnia. But very time consuming, or the other way of doing it is going in and looking at some of the existing reviews where they've done that work for you. So ESSA has done that, and they published their evidence. And then whether, what level of support there is for it. So Language Live, one of the things that you have to be careful of when you're reading these reports here is that Language Live was such a new program. When the ESSA did their reviews, they didn't have a time to review it. And so that, right. And so they just have not been able to, they're waiting for additional research to come out. This is one where you would have to go in and look at the review or the data coming out from the publishing company itself, from Language Live. I know also some of that they based off of the research behind Language Exclamation Point. Another thing to do, that to be careful of, when like this was a review by Ed Reports. And what happens with this is an example of an intervention I mentioned earlier called Connecting Math Concepts, right? And it didn't review well, but when you have to look at, so what was it about the program? And it was the alignment, right? And so not meeting not doing a good job of aligning to the Common Core standards by grade. And so, but if you think about the tier 3 type of math students at the elementary level or middle school level, that these kids are not doing poorly because it's the big concepts of Common Core that they're having trouble with. It's the basic skills. And so I wouldn't be as concerned about the alignment for something like tier 3 math interventions, that if they're not doing a great job of aligning to grade level standards, I'm not overly concerned about that as much as I would be interested in what's the instructional design. How does it teach? Is it going to teach and actually allow kids to master the critical skills? Right. So you have to be careful with some of these reviews. Sometimes the programs don't review well because of alignment and not because it doesn't work. Right. And so I just wanted to offer that as just a heads up. Another place that you could look at a review that was I mentioned at the beginning of this today, that I worked with Oregon Reading First. And at the time I was there was a supplemental and tier 3 intervention review that was completed. And I wanted to show you that on the Oregon, the Center on Teaching and Learning website out of the University of Oregon. And here's where you can access it. Actually, it's on the Reading First. There's a link to the Oregon Reading First, to the review that they completed on a number of programs that are still out there. A lot of these intervention programs were in existence when this review was done clear back in 2000. So this was done some time ago. But a lot of these, like corrective reading, they were reviewed back then. So if you want to go back and look at how did it fare, that is there. The other thing I wanted to show you is that this is a tool that if you were interested, so say you were using a program and you can't find any research on it whatsoever, you could actually go in and conduct a review yourself by using the tools that are available through that Oregon Reading First for reading. This was targeted in reading, right? Reading first. So, but anyway, here's just the, if you're interested, there is a tool on there that you could, and I've worked with schools that have done this, that you could use, go in and have a small group of people do the review of the program yourself. But I want you to get an idea of like, what kinds of things are they looking for, right, when a review is conducted. So if it's a review by an expert panel, what kinds of things are they looking for? Is there uniformity in what they're, so that everybody's on the same page and so on and so forth. Here's some additional links for selecting interventions that you could, that I think would be very helpful to look at. There's the What Works Clearinghouse, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, Evidence-Based Intervention Network. Here's some additional ones and the links for them. Reading Rockets. We talked about the National Center on Intensive Intervention. There's ESSA and how to access the ESSA reports, U.S. Department of Education. So I mentioned some interventions today that would meet the criteria of being evidence-based or research validated, excuse me. I've shown examples of those programs. If you have programs that have not been mentioned, that you're either considering or that you already have them and you're wanting to know if they're research, what the research is behind them, here are some places that you could go and look at in terms of, so the existing reviews that are already out there, and you could go in and maybe hopefully be able to identify that program and what the reviews have shown on it. So like, don't reinvent the wheel. This stuff, a lot of this is already out there. So these are the links to those reviews, those existing intervention reviews, some in reading, some in math, some both. So I highly recommend that you use this, take advantage of it. And then just getting to the end here, we'll talk about what the assignment is. I think what you'll have to do now as a team, as you went through, you heard this information, just got to take stock of like, what do you already have in place? And we talked about that intervention audit. You'll want to go back, have that audit completed in terms of just taking stock of like what's in your school. And I would look at in the special ed room, the Title I room, anybody, I'd ask people, or do you have interventions? What are those? What are some of the things that are already being used or that are just in existence, even though in your building, even though they're not being used? And maybe across the entire district, right? Not just within your grade level or your building. And then identify, what interventions you have and what are they designed to do, and if they're evidence or research validated, and then identify where are your holes. Like, for instance, you may identify we don't have a tier 3 math intervention for K3 or K5. We may not have a tier 2 intervention that targets comprehension. And so when you identify those areas that are missing or that are weaknesses within your existing system, then you're going to identify here are some of the areas that we're going to need to fill. So we're going to need to get some intervention programs for these purposes. And I would want to come up with a list of like, well, what are we talking about here? What are those possible programs that we may want to look at that could be utilized for this purpose? And then you could order samples, bring them in, and so that what you're really doing is you're trying to work towards this idea of by the end of the school year, you want to have, and actually you don't want to wait till the end of the school year, the sooner the better, that you could have these interventions that you're potentially looking at, that you're considering, being able to identify what those are, ordering the samples so that you can then make selections and have that materials ready to go by the fall of next school year. So that's the goal. So that's what I would hope that you would do as a result of what we've talked about so far. and using the information that I've presented here to help you look at your existing interventions or select new interventions if that's necessary. I call this the intervention sequence, just a couple of suggestions here. There needs to be some focus on ensuring that, we talked about interventions, but there's another aspect to this, and that is the coordination of the interventions, the ensuring that where everybody's on the same page, right? And that there's alignment of the interventions from one grade to another. So what we don't want is kids are in an intervention in grade 1 and then they go to grade 2 and there's some other type of intervention that doesn't pick up where we left off from grade 1. So I would just want to know that we've got a plan that is coherent and that's consistent across the grades. And so this idea of an intervention sequence, we'll talk more about this at the next training. But just that idea is like we really need to take into consideration that the interventions need to be aligned so that there's a lot of consistency. So that the same intervention being used in K as a tier 3 intervention would be the same one being used in grade 1, would be the same one being used in grade 2. It just the kids would be in different levels of it, so that you're not having multiple interventions going on within the same school. I think that's something you'd want to avoid. So this idea of an intervention sequence, here's just another example of that. This one was a K5, this one was a K8 example and then math as well. Same thing with math. You want to have a coherent sequence for the interventions that would be used so that kids could move their way through. And some students may need to be in intervention for multiple years. So we just need those interventions to be aligned from one grade level to another as kids move through. So here's what we're asking you to do. That's really, some of this were the assignment that was from our first part that we covered when we were together on day 2. Complete your assessment audit, looking at what are the assessments that are out there, and then that identifying what do you have in place, what are you missing, and then mapping out some of the programs that you feel like would be necessary to address those holes that you have, and then ordering some of the sample material and bring those and just bring back your questions and your completed intervention audit to our day 3 training. Bring that back with you. What you're doing, and we talked about this on when we were together, is you're building this pathway, right? So now you're at the point where you're wanting to move towards being able to write in what are the interventions that are going to be used, and that'll be written in on the pathway itself, right? So that idea of a placement pathway, we talked about what's your screener, what's your diagnostic criteria, and then we talked about what intervention is actually going to be used for a tier 2 student in fluency or for a tier 3 student in grade 3. So those are examples of it. Okay, let us know if you have questions, reach out, don't hesitate. This has been, feel free to go back and re-listen to any part of this presentation about specific interventions and the kinds of things that you're looking for. I think this might be a way to get you off to a good start. That's what I view this as, a good start. It's not the end all. And then we are going to have time to talk and spend some more time on this intervention idea when we get together on day 3. So like I said, don't hesitate to reach out. I appreciate everybody's time. And I look forward to seeing you, and the rest of our team looks forward to seeing you on day 3. So until next time, happy holidays, everybody. We're a few days before Christmas here. So, all right. Thank you.